Welcome everyone to Temple Beth-El, Jersey City's first talk series, Skip the Flowers. I'm one of your co-hosts, Beth Achenbach. I've lived in Jersey City for about 18 years and I'm an artist and a curator and host of various cultural events. I've been a secular Jew most of my life, but about 3 years ago, I took an Intro to Judaism class at Temple Beth-El, and now I'm a member there and also on the board of trustees. Tonight, we're going to have an open talk about death and mourning in the Jewish community. If you're joining us as a member of the interfaith community or someone that's just curious, we welcome you. We're glad that you're here. And we hope that everyone takes something away from this discussion. Now, I'm going to introduce my co-host. Before joining Temple Beth-El of Jersey City as a congregational leader in 2018, my co-host, a native New Yorker, made her mark in the tri-state Jewish community, serving as rabbi for the Roosevelt Island Jewish Congregation, as director for places like New York 72nd Street Y, instructor in the International Melton Adult Education Program, and the Union for Reform Judaism's Introduction to Judaism. She is a Klal Rabbis Without Borders Rabbinic Fellow, director and founder of Thresholds for the Jewishly Curious, and a chaplain offering spiritual care to the homebound elderly. An engaging teacher of Torah and leader of prayer and chant, she is known for guiding Jews, families, and Jews by choice toward more meaningful Jewish lives, and with a focus on teaching Judaism to interfaith audiences and adults seeking to spiritually infuse or enter Jewish life, which makes her a great leader in our community and the perfect person to talk to tonight. Please welcome Rabbi Leana Moritt.
Thank you, Beth. Thank you. You know, just two short stories I'd like to start with. And one actually came to me this afternoon and that I really want to share with you because it took me back quite a long time ago. I was in my mid-20s and I had a very elderly father who came under my care. I took care of him for 6 years before he died. And when he came under my care, I knew he was declining and declining rapidly. And I didn't really know how to handle that. I didn't know what to make of it. It was, what was I going to do? And that was actually my entree, or one of my entrees into the deeper study of Judaism. I was invited by my synagogue's Hevra Kadisha, which is, I'll explain later, but it's a committee that helps guide people through this process, and started learning. And it was actually learning the deep well of wisdom and the understanding of deep human needs and psychology in the Jewish traditions around death and mourning that really hooked me. It was something that just struck me as so profound that it led me to further study of the tradition in general. So it's something that I continue to really very much like to teach. So thank you for indulging me by asking me questions about this topic today. Because
I feel like you're indulging me, because as a newer practicing Jew, there's a lot of things that I don't know, and I have a very curious mind anyway. And I remember how we actually happened to this talk. We were in a board meeting, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about Temple Beth-El has burial plots at, right, 2 cemeteries, I believe.
Actually, just a little bit of a plug, one of them, and believe me, in my line of work, I go to a lot of cemeteries. But just Temple Beth-El's cemetery plot is, I would say, if not then one of the most beautiful Jewish cemeteries in the state. And that it is so close to New York and so close to everything is really quite remarkable. So if you're curious about that, just let us know. We're happy to tell you more. Please continue.
But anyway, yeah, during our board meeting, Rabbi Moritt brought this up, and she also, I'll always remember this, that you said that it's a mitzvah, a good deed, to actually plan ahead your own after death services.
Yeah,
Which,
what you want and how you want it and where you want it. It's true. And I'm sure I'm not alone in experiencing when somebody that we love has died. And when that happens, if you recall back, it is such an unnerving, discombobulating time where we literally don't know what step to put in front of the other. And it's at that point where, if all of the things that need to get taken care of are already taken care of, that is a huge chesed. That's a huge kindness that you can do for your loved one, to not have to make them go through that when you die, because they'll be ripped apart. So that's why it's a mitzvah.
nice. I just see that there's a quick question. Can someone go visit the cemetery?
Of course. I mean, if you're curious, you can visit it on your own. Happy to give you the address and let you know when it's open. It's a Jewish cemetery. Other than maybe Shabbat, it's always going to be open. But if there are enough people that would like a tour, I could do like a little tour of headstones or something. I mean, then I'm happy to do a field trip, masked, whatever. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, great. I want to get into, I think part of what we're talking about right now in the planning and not planning is one of the things that I found is that people in general don't talk about death and dying enough. And I believe that's what we were talking, that's where we went to when we had this board meeting. And that's what brought us to having this talk, is that we need to have more open discussions about death and dying, and that it's okay to talk about it. Why do you think that people don't talk about it?
Well,
Usual. It's
yeah. Look, we are American, our more secular society. We always like to put a happy, positive sheen on things, right? And I think death is like almost like the ultimate bummer for that. So, and that's in contradistinction to Judaism. It's not like we dwell in it. We certainly don't. We're a tradition about life, not death, but we understand it as a natural part, and everybody does it. Everybody dies. And so being able to walk somebody through it and having everybody know what is expected, if you will, makes people feel less alone. It's one of those beautiful things that I was mentioning before. In our tradition, in our American secular, you say, how are they doing? Which really, if somebody has just lost a loved one, is, if you think about it, probably the stupidest question you could ever ask. But we'll ask, because sort of by definition, they're not going to be doing so well. But in our secular culture, right, it's sort of expected that we put a happy face on her, or she's doing well, or that it's better if you're not affected by the loss of a loved one. But if you think about it, if somebody that you love and has been a part of your life for years, perhaps even your whole life, and that relationship means something, how could it possibly be that losing them doesn't affect you? And the Jewish tradition assumes it's going to affect you, and sort of calls everybody around to hold us up until we can kind of regain our footing and then re-enter a semblance of normalcy.
Yeah, I mean, you think about other cultures in the Middle East and I think in Africa and stuff, people, when someone dies, they wail, they let it out. And I remember reading about a village that when someone in the village dies, everyone in the village changes something in their home so
Huh.
that things are never, it's like that person is gone, so nothing will be the same because they're gone, which I thought was
Antithesis to our culture, which is, more of a denial of death. That what you're describing is something is like, it's real, name it and claim it and work with it and process it, allow it to affect you so that you can move back out of it and back into life at the end of the process.
right, right. So I want to talk a little bit. I want to actually step back from the death and actually get into just maybe the stage of end of life. You're with somebody that's dying, probably in a few hours or in a day. What did Jews have a sort of last rites?
We have a number of them, actually. And before we get to, sort of the official, I wouldn't quite say it's last rites. One thing that the tradition does say is that if somebody is in the active stage of dying, they shouldn't be left alone. Even if you don't think they can hear you or even sense your presence, the tradition says that they shouldn't ever feel like they're alone in this. And in fact, if any of you have ever spent time with somebody who's dying, or read the literature, we know that the sense of hearing and the sense of touch are the last things to go. So it is a beautiful and very appropriate thing to sing, speak gently, whisper words of affection, sometimes even words that allow somebody to let go, which sometimes is a very difficult thing to do, but sometimes people need that. The tradition is very clear that if somebody is in that active dying, and it is inevitable, when we know that there's no life-saving measures, because ultimately we're about saving lives, and if that's possible, and that's the route that you do. But we all know that there are some situations where that's just not possible. And the tradition says that leave them alone, let them be in peace, and don't disturb them. So just give them that space while allowing them to feel surrounded by support and love, even music. If it was my father, he'd want the baseball game on the radio, but that's another story.
That's when my brother-in-law was passing away, and it was me and my sisters around him. We could sort of sense that he was a little uncomfortable, and they pretty much knew that he was going to be passing away pretty soon. We actually put the horse races on the television, and he seemed, he loved to go to the horse races, and he actually taught me. He was one of the people that taught me how to bet when we went to the horse races. So it was just something we could sort of see that he relaxed a little, and I think he didn't need to hear us chattering about anyway, the three of us, but yeah.
No, it's wonderful. And a case in point. And also about the chattering, realize that what you're talking about, they can hear. So the tradition is very clear that we treat somebody as fully alive until they are no longer. So of course the rules about how it is that we talk in front of them would apply, like you're not talking about them, step outside. But you mentioned the last rites, and there is a tradition, and it's a bit old world, if you will. And it's most often done by clergy. People have asked me to do this before, which is changing a person's name. Just sort of quick show of hands if you've heard of that, of changing somebody's name when they're deathly ill. So in this, people don't wait till the very end, because it's really not really appropriate. If you really, really know that they're going to die, it's less appropriate. But if somebody is very sick and we're really, really praying for their recovery, there's this tradition of changing somebody's name. And as I said, it's a little old world, and it goes sort of like this, is that, the Malach HaMavet, the angel of death, is dispatched to earth with his list of the people that he's going to take back with him into the next world. And he comes to the bed and he's looking for Shmulik, right? But the rabbi's been there 10 minutes before and changed his name. So he's no longer Shmulik, he's Chaim, right? So the angel of death comes and looks for Shmulik and is like, no, that's Chaim. Okay, next. So as I said, it's a little old world, but that is one tradition. And there's another tradition that is a little bit less, if you will, superstitious, but still comforting to many, which is the last confession. And that might sound very Catholic, but in fact, it's something that Jews have done for a very long time. And people can say it themselves, or again, as a rabbi, I have done it on behalf of people who can't speak for themselves, by family members that have asked me to do this. And the prayers is a little bit, goes something like, I understand that life and death is in your hands, God, and I pray desperately for life. But if it is the case that it's my time, let it be that all of the things that I've done, I'm forgiven for, and that this is offering as an apology for anybody that I've hurt and harmed. And let it be that my death is an atonement for those wrongs. And it kind of goes like that. So it's a way of sort of giving somebody the last chance to say that they're sorry, and let it be that that apology sort of be on the official record, if you will.
Wow, that's great. I have a quick question. Kat wants to know who decides the name to change.
You mean like the new name?
Yeah.
New name? Well, if the person's still cognizant and has an idea, they're perfectly capable and able to decide their own name. If not, a very common one for a man is Chaim, which means life. And for a woman, it's Chaya or Chava, which is the feminine of that, which means life, right? Or mother of all life. So that's a very common one to give at that moment.
Wow. All right, now we're going to go. Let's say our person has passed away. Is there something that at that moment that one would say?
Yeah. So traditionally, you say the words Baruch Dayan Ha'emet, which is blessed is the true judge, or blessed is the judge of truth. It means the same thing. And that's actually very ancient and biblical. And it's actually a very old tradition that at that moment, either if you're there or the moment that you hear about a death, that you rip an article of clothing that you're wearing. You may be familiar with that same ritual that's done in more modern circles, just as the funeral is beginning. And that is because there are many people that either don't know of that ritual to be done at the moment of death, or when you hear of the death, or they find it a particularly meaningful thing to do again. So if you've seen it at both times, that's where it comes from.
And that's the Kriya.
Kriya, yes.
Am I saying that right?
Yeah. And I'll just say, what it really is. And so when you have that article of clothing that's ripped, or by the way, the rabbi will pin a black ribbon on you at the beginning of a funeral. I know we're jumping ahead a little bit, but we can backtrack. Yeah. At the beginning of a funeral, rabbi is going to pin a little black ribbon on you, and it's a self-ripping ribbon, so it's all ready to go. Funeral directors have this, and the ribbon gets ripped, and you wear that ribbon for up to 30 days after the funeral, or up to 30 days after the funeral, even if you rip it at the moment of death. And you wear that, and it's a public, if you will, display. And it's very, I think it's very, very profound, because what it does is, first, it tells anybody that you encounter while wearing that ribbon that it's marking you as someone that's a little ripped up inside, or that somebody that you love has been ripped from your life. And so by wearing that for a period of time, it helps remind people to treat you maybe with a little bit of extra gentleness or a little extra TLC. So again, it's so as not to assume that everything's just status quo, and there to follow your emotional lead. Yeah. So and the other thing is that just like we don't ever leave somebody alone when they're dying, we don't leave a body alone from the moment of death to the moment of burial. And there's actually a whole bunch of rituals about that. We can get into it, or I don't know if you want to ask, but
We're
yeah.
going to get into that. Don't you worry.
Fine, I'll wait for you.
I'm curious, how old is this ripping of the cloth?
This is biblical. This is like you open up Torah, and it's right there. There are a number of times in Bible where it says, he heard of the death, and he ripped his clothes and sat in sackcloth and ashes, which the modern equivalent of sitting, right, is the shiva. But so renting their clothes and sitting in sackcloth, that's as old as they come.
So that's where the sitting shiva comes from? So that's how I was going to ask you.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely evolved, as so many other things in Judaism have evolved. I mean, we don't sit in sackcloth and ashes. I always tell my intro students, the Bible, Judaism is not what it says in the Bible. Nobody takes the Bible literally. Judaism is how it has evolved over the hundreds and thousands of years to the way we live it now. The Bible is the starting point. I like to call it the blueprint.
Fabulous. Okay, we're going to start on so our person has passed away and their body has been taken. Well, before that happens, so you were talking about there's a burial society, right? When do they actually come into play? Do you contact them before the body's even gone to a funeral home?
You can. Yeah, as I said, before I went on this crazy journey to seminary and rabbinic school, I was a Jew in the pew. And as a Jew in the pew, I used to belong to a Chevra Kadisha, which is this burial society. And sometimes, obviously you don't know if it's sudden, but sometimes we would know something is coming. And so we would be ready. So just a little talk about that, it wasn't an Orthodox synagogue. This was actually a non-denominational liberal synagogue, but it was a large synagogue, definitely need critical mass. But we had our own Chevra Kadisha society. So we had our own group of people that, we would mobilize into place. And we knew that if a member of our community would lose somebody, that, we would make sure that, shiva was covered, that there was always enough people there to make the minyan. Somebody was going to lead it. We'll talk about all these things. And that there were people that were always going to be with the body, and that they were going to prepare the body for burial. Those are the traditional responsibilities of the Chevra Kadisha Society. Now, not every synagogue has that, and Temple Beth-El does not have that. Please God, maybe one day this is something that we would want to take up. It would be an amazing thing. I would be so proud to be part of helping to do that. But a Jewish funeral home will know how to contact another society or people who perform these rituals, on behalf of unaffiliated people or people that don't have a committee to sort of swoop in, if you will. Did I answer the question? I sort of lost track.
I think you answered that question.
Okay.
So part of the issue is that Jews need to be buried quickly, right? Yeah. So I want us to know why that is.
Right.
And one of the other things I'm curious about is it ever so quick that someone gets buried the same day?
Oh yeah, in Israel it's more common, but it does happen. So why it is it has a couple of, the original one is, well, of course, before refrigeration, And before people needing to fly in from Florida for the service, right? If you have a body, you would know that you needed to bury it right away because decomposition was going to happen. And remember, this is the ancient Near East. It's hot. Decomposition is going to start sooner. You're not going to leave it around. So that's a cultural, historical, medical, hygienic answer, but that's not a particularly compelling answer, I think, for today. And from a spiritual perspective, we understand that the body is a sacred vessel. This is the vessel that held the soul of people that we loved. And because of that, everything we do from the moment of death on is with the utmost respect and gentleness and loving care as we can offer to that vessel. And the tradition understands that the way that we honor most is to allow that person, that body, if you will, to go back to the earth from which it comes. The Hebrew word for human being is Adam. It's one of the earliest words in the Bible. The Hebrew word for earth is Adamah. So it's embedded in the psychology or in the linguistic understanding of the patterns of the universe that we are earthlings. And that sort of from the element of earth we come, and back to the element of earth we go for a gentle, slow, natural decomposition, at which point our body becomes fertilizer for the next season. By the way, our soul, and we'll talk about this later, I do hope, our soul undergoes the same, if you will, recycling mode, if you will, in the same way that our body does. So burying right away is, one, hygienic, two, how we honor the body, but also, and this is really, really important, because the mitzvah of supporting the mourners and helping them, holding them, carrying them through this process of shock, getting used to this, mourning, and then eventual returning back into life. That in the Jewish tradition is something that, we kind of move in and do that right away. And we understand that we can't do that until the mitzvah of burying the dead is done. So we take care of the mitzvah of caring for the dead as soon as possible so that we can move on to the supporting of those who are left behind and whose job is to now turn that love for that person into sacred memory.
Wow, that's great. I want to talk, it's out of this respect and honor for the body that, is that why we don't embalm?
Oh yeah, yes. So, yes. So, look, there are times that you have to, but in general, embalming is frowned upon in the Jewish tradition, as is autopsies. If for legal reasons, because in the Jewish tradition, the law of the land is the law, and if for some reason there's a legal reason, there's any number of different situations, rather not sort of get into, you have to. Usually you only have to embalm if you're not going to bury within a certain amount of time. And look, for that, I just want to put out there, death, by definition, never happens at a convenient time. I mean, it sounds like an obvious thing, but so I always encourage people not to wait until so-and-so can fly in next week to have the funeral. It is in the Jewish tradition, and for many of us, we've experienced this, we feel very unnerved and disconnected until the funeral happens. There's this sense of moving on to the next stage of grief or mourning or process, whatever it is that happens with burial. So again, this is another reason why, sort of psychologically speaking, the tradition is just so wise in saying, get the burial done as soon as possible so that you can get that part done and start taking care of the rest. And so, right. So usually, legally speaking, you only have to embalm if burial doesn't come. But we see that, if you will, as like an invasion, as almost like a desecration of this sacred vessel that is your loved one. Because remember, we don't do viewings and open caskets. So that would be completely antithetical to growing into an acceptance of the loss, right? Making somebody up and painting their face and putting makeup on them and dressing them as if they are alive is counter to the spiritual, psychological goal of turning that person into sacred memory and accepting the loss and moving through that, again, supported. So that's why, again, the embalming, the open casket, the wakes. Jews don't do wakes. We want to get to a dignified, quick, sacred burial, earthing them, and then moving on to the next. I feel like 6 tangents and not sure if I ever asked the question.
You're doing good, and you're touching on things that we're going to come to too. So we don't autopsy and embalm unless it has to happen. But I want to ask about organ donation.
Yeah. No, and you asked about also organ donation. You asked about the autopsy. Same thing. It sounds a little silly, but it's like if somebody's dead, most often either you know what killed them, or if you really think about it, it doesn't really matter so much. They've died, and that's so. Autopsies, again, are also generally frowned upon unless there is a very specific situation that may need study. So, for example, if a crime has been committed and there's something in the autopsy that might bring somebody to justice, or, for example, if there's something in that person that needs to be found out to cure a specific person, not a general scientific inquiry. In the Jewish tradition, that's generally not good enough reason to do an autopsy. But you asked about organ donation. Thank you very much. Very important. Yes, 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 yes. Jews absolutely believe in organ donation. It is a mitzvah. So if you haven't signed your card, sign your card. You may say, hang on a second. I'm not sure if the Orthodox do this. And I'm just going to say very quickly, write this down, HODS.org. HODS.org. That stands for Halachic Organ Donor Society.org. It's a completely Orthodox website that will get into more detail about Orthodox organ donation that you ever wanted to know. And believe me, don't take my word for it, go there. Orthodox definitely do organ donation. I'm just going to address really quickly why people think the Orthodox don't believe in it. One is there is a difference of opinion between the Orthodox world and the non-Orthodox world as to what constitutes death. In many cases, the Orthodox do not consider brain death as death. So if, an EEG shows, 0 brainstem function, but the heart is still pumping, the non-Orthodox world is going to say there's nothing there, and that person is functionally passed. That's not necessarily the decision that will be made by an Orthodox decisor. So that's one difference of opinion. The other comes from, if you will, well, I'll leave it to you. It's an afterlife. It's an afterlife story. Idea in Judaism. So you can tell me, say it now, or you say, save it for later.
Yeah, we have an afterlife discussion coming up.
The organ donor thing then, and Go ahead.
Yeah. I want to get into a little bit more detail about the burial society and what some of that process is when they are taking care of your person that has passed away.
There are two basic functions. One is, I'll use the Hebrew and then I'll translate it. One is our shomrim, or the masculine is a shomer, the feminine is a shomeret, and the group, they're shomrim. And that translates as guards or keepers. And their job simply is to sit outside the room where the body is and keep it company. Usually they take shifts of, 2, 3, 4 hours from the time of death until burial. Another reason why we keep that short. Um, and and you might think, well, that's a strange thing. And again, there are sociological reasons, but I think there are really profound spiritual reasons. Sociological reason is that there was a time in history that there were people that would steal bodies, and this was to make sure that nothing was going to happen. But I think a more compelling spiritual reason is, and maybe you've experienced this, any of you, that you're in a hospital room or even in their bed or in bedroom, and somebody that you love has died, and maybe even, God forbid, it's a child, and they have to be taken away, right? They have to be removed from the hospital room, or they have to be taken to the morgue, or they have to be taken somewhere, and you're not ready to let them go, right? And so the knowledge that somebody will always be watching over them from now until they're sort of safely taken to their final rest can offer a real profound peace of mind, or at least lessen the anxiety just that much more, knowing that somebody will always be with them. They're not going to be lost. They're not going to be misidentified. They're not going to be any number of ideas that people have in that moment of great anxiety and loss.
Can family members play that role? Is that allowed?
So
or at least take a shift?
right. So there are, and we're going to get to this, there are 7 relatives, 7 relations that make you an official mourner. And that's if it's your mother, your father, your brother, your sister, your son, your daughter, or your spouse. If they die, that makes you an official mourner. And there are many other family members, my aunts, my uncle, my nephew, my grandmother, right? That's family, but you're not that first degree relative. The tradition is much more likely to say, if you're not a first degree relative, take a shift. But really, if it's an immediate, profound loss, it's for people to gather around, allow you the space to get to the next level. So you traditionally wouldn't be a shomer or shomeret if it's immediate. It wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. I'm not sure. As a rabbi, I probably wouldn't recommend it as the best thing to be doing at that moment, is to sort of be holding on to the physicality when the time is to really sort of start to process the loss, if that makes sense. The second role of some of the Hever Kadisha is to prepare the body for burial. Do you want me to get into that now? Because I think
yes, we were going to roll that way.
Yay, cool. All right. So, and I have to say, it's probably one of the most profound things that you can experience as a human being, as to be part of a team that prepares somebody for their final rest. And actually, traditionally, it's kind of reserved. It's seen as like, if you were in traditional circles, if you were tapped for the Hever Kadisha committee, then you are seen as a very holy person in your community. And as a matter of fact, you don't even really talk about it and brag about it, because that would be seen as like not really being modest. So in a traditional community, you're not really sure as to who is or who isn't, because you wouldn't go, oh yeah, I do that. Yeah. So that's a little bit about the mythology, if you will, about it. But it's a very humbling, I'm sure you can imagine, experience to prepare somebody. So what's involved? As simply as possible. First off, it's done in either complete silence or only by chanting and humming nigunim in the presence. So there's an air of very profound respect that happens in the room. It's done at the funeral home. And the first thing that's done is that any clothes or hospital garb or bandages or IVs or tracheal tubes or anything that is jewelry, all of that is removed, and the person is brought to their pure and natural state. The tradition says, as we come into this world all together, so we go out of the world all of the same. The team will very gently and lovingly wash the body, the hair, make sure that there are no scabs, um, uh, nail polish, if you will, just like a baby, like you're taking care of that person like a baby. And once that person is washed, I will say that there are some Jewish funeral homes that have a mikveh, if you're familiar with what that is. And then the mate, which is the Hebrew word for the body, the mate is immersed in the mikveh. It's not the same mikveh that live people go to. It's in the funeral home. But not all Jewish funeral homes have this. And then buckets of water are used if there's no mikveh. And once the mate is washed and sort of taken care of like a baby, then they are dressed. And I'll use the Hebrew, it's tachrichim, which are very simple burial garments. It usually gets translated poorly as shrouds, which I don't like that, because that makes me feel like thinking of like a shmata, a rag, and that's not what they are. They're white or off-white cotton or linen. Again, men and women get the exact same. Rich and poor, they get the exact same. It's like a little drawstring pants, a tunic, a jacket, which gets, tied closed, little booties, little mittens, a little like a bonnet. And then there is actually then another piece that goes over the face to cover that. So they are wrapped in that, then put into the aron, into the coffin. The only thing that ever gets put traditionally into a coffin is sometimes somebody's prayer shawl with the tzitzit cut off. Personally, I'm not a big fan of that. I would rather give it to the living, a grandchild, a niece, a nephew. I think that's a wonderful bequest, somebody's prayer shawl, rather than burying it, but okay. And then there is a little bit of earth from Jerusalem. Often there are these little packets of earth that Jewish funeral homes have, symbolically to start the process of bringing back to the earth. And also, again, with our connection to the land of Israel. So if you can't get buried in Israel, you take a little bit of Israel and bury it with you. And then some people put in shards of broken pottery as a symbol of the fact that this is now that this vessel, it's an incomplete vessel. It's a broken vessel.
Wow, I never heard that.
And then it's closed.
So no jewelry, no favorite tchotchke.
Look, do people do that? People do that. I'm talking about the tradition. Yeah.
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 And then into a plain pine box, right?
Yeah. Again, it's a plain pine box without varnish or without metal parts, because or without satin. The idea of like we want to make her comfortable by giving her a nice pillow is like it's not quite anthropomorphizing, but at that point the idea of comfort is really not the question. the idea of a plain aron, the plain coffin without any metal parts, because we don't want anything to get in the way of, again, this slow, beautiful, natural decomposition, and metal parts or chemicals get in the way of that. Are we going to talk about green and environmental things? Are you going to get to that, or is now a good time to talk about that?
Well, I was gonna ask you about cremation, and we can go into that. But Nancy's giving a question about, can prayer books go into the grave but not in the coffin?
Thank you. Thank you, Nancy, for asking that question. So it's actually, it may feel, if you've never heard of this, to be like a little jarring for the funeral director to say, oh, do you mind if we put some books in the grave? But in fact, when sacred books that can, in Hebrew, contain the name of God, have reached the end of their useful life, one of only two ways of respectfully disposing of them is by burying them, because they're the living word, right? It's alive. And so they will often, you'll see books thrown into the grave along with the aron. So it's actually an honor to be able to be buried with books. And we actually did that about 2 years ago, I think, Nancy, right? We did so much cleaning out. Boy, you should see the place. It is so clean. And we had all of these books, and we actually had a little ceremony for that, which was beautiful.
If you were doing the mitzvah of planning your own burial, is that something, do you think you could leave in your instructions, that it's okay to put some books in there?
Thank you. Sure. Especially if you don't think that your family is familiar with it. And that reminds me, I've just sort of finished my will, and I'm doing my own little notes to my kids. I'm trying to follow my own advice and take care of my affairs. Please God, it won't be for another, 120 years, what have you, but I'm going to include that. So yes, it would be a very appropriate thing to throw in there.
Excellent. So, all right. So then we'll get on this topic, because it was a question that I had done. I had grabbed a few friends in a Facebook group and knew we were doing this talk, and I asked them some of the things they were curious about. And this was up there, and it's about Jews and cremation, and whether it's kosher or not kosher, okay, not okay.
Right.
What's your word on that?
The word is, traditionally, as I explained before, we're earthlings. From the earth we come, from the earth we go. And the most Jewish way of understanding how to treat a body gently and respectfully is to bring them back to the earth. That being said, are there Jews that cremate? We all know that there are Jews that cremate. There are there are many that see that as an unnecessarily harsh and not gentle way of treating, again, the sacred vessel that is your loved one. The piece that I really want to bring home is that if you think that cremating is better for the environment, then you've got some learning to do, because in fact, the process of cremating a body uses an incredible amount of energy that gets spewed out into the atmosphere. And in fact, a traditional Jewish burial, as I am describing, is completely indistinguishable of the most green burial. So if you follow the green death or the green burial movement, what they're basically describing is a traditional Jewish burial.
I got a question from Kat about recompose.
You're going to have to tell me what that is.
What is that, Kat?
What's composting? So, by the way, the putting earth into the coffin, that's sort of starting the composting.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's what you're talking about, Kat. But as a rabbi, I would say that, adding compost material along with the earth from Jerusalem is, not only permissible, but I would say, sort of putting the spiritual idea and underpinning of what it's meant to do on steroids. So yes.
I did read that some places actually drill holes in the pine box. Is that
Yeah, that would be totally kosher.
to help that out?
Yeah.
So I want to talk about that earth, going back to the earth, because you and I had discussed this previously, but some people that are proponents of cremation actually use that um, Genesis 3:19, for dust you are and dust you shall return.
Yeah. Right. And we looked at that. I'm like, let me pull that out. And I'm like, and Beth's talking to me, and I'm like busy with my face in the Bible and translating and looking at the words. The translate, it's like dust. People go, oh, to the dust. That means ashes or dust and ashes. But in fact, the word is Adam, Adama, right? So it actually says into the earth. And then it gets often translated as something else, but that pasuk, that sentence in Torah, actually it specifically says to the earth. Yeah.
Yeah. Sam is bringing up a point about cremation being cheaper than plots and caskets.
So that's gonna depend on where you're getting your plots and how much it costs to cremate. I want to say two things. One, in my years of being a rabbi, I can't tell you the number of times that people will call me a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10, 15 years later and says, I've got my mother's ashes. They've been in the back of the closet. I don't know what to do with them. And I'm thinking I should probably bury them. And because you should also know that there are very strict rules and laws about where you can scatter. So you can't just scatter ashes anywhere you want. So a lot of times people have them around and they wind up burying them anyway. I want to also kind of give you the heads up, because the death business is a for-profit business. And there are far too many unscrupulous funeral directors that play on people's heightened emotional state at the time and use that to pad the bill, so to speak, because you can't go somewhere else at that point. They've got grandma, right? And they're showing you very expensive coffins or padding on this or padding on that, which is another reason why, if you will, a traditional Jewish burial of the simplicity, the speed, and the way it is the very often, if not the cheapest, one of the cheapest ways to go, right? Because remember, if you're going to be refrigerating that body for 4, 5, 6, 7 days, waiting for somebody to fly in, you're charged for each and every one of those days, right? So again, yes, there is a cost to the funeral plot. There's a cost to the plot, but and I can't compare the price of cremation because I just don't have the lists in front of me.
Well, and that's where planning your own might come into play, because you've already paid for it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Which is also one less thing to burden your loved ones with. Yeah.
Wow. I want to just, because I want us to get to everything, but I want to ask, because I was watching a show on different ways that people die, and is there any issue with suicide or?
And I just want to thank you for suicide. I just want to backtrack for cremation one more time. You should also know there's some rabbis that will not officiate at a cremation. And so that may or may not be a factor in a decision. But you should also know that there are many that choose to ground cremains. Again, that's sort of environmentally, you're sort of burning and then burying, and then you're spending for both. So, but I have had people come to me, 5 years later, and we'll open a grave and we'll ground the cremains. So yes, you were asking about suicide.
Yeah, if someone killed themselves, or if there maybe, I don't think we're one of the states where terminally ill people can have assisted suicide, but is there any issue with that and people being buried in a Jewish cemetery?
No, this is one of those places where there's the law, and then there is the incredible compassion of the practitioners of the law and the tradition. So bear with me on this. The law is really, really clear. You don't commit suicide. You just don't. It's one of the worst offenses that you can do. And if you do, there are any number of burial rites that can be withheld. Bear with me.
Mm-hmm.
And this is the big and. So if you're thinking about what I just said and go, oh, this is awful, how inhumane is Judaism, put that on the back burner for 2 seconds, because this big and is really important. And the rabbis, the tradition says that basically, if anybody commits suicide, it means that they are in so much pain that they can't possibly be in their right mind. And we do not treat somebody who's not entirely in their right mind as being responsible for committing suicide. So while we might call it suicide, and we know that it's suicide, from a Jewish rabbinic perspective, we don't call it that, because that would mean that we would have to treat them as something else, as a murderer, right? And they're not a murderer, they're in so much pain. So practically speaking, it's interesting. And sometimes this is a little bit of a cognitive disconnect, because if you're talking to a rabbi and that rabbi knows it's suicide, but won't call it suicide, because if he calls it suicide, he has to do something that he doesn't want to do or she doesn't want to do. Does this make sense? Am I making sense? Which is giving the full, compassionate, loving, supportive funeral that person deserves.
Okay, thank you for answering that. So I want to go into the framework of the phases of mourning. In Judaism, we have these phases. They're laid out for us. It's kind of like, all right, a set of guidelines. Can you just kind of walk us through those? And I might stop you in there to interject a question here and there.
Please do. Yeah. So again, the very first one is it's got a name. It's Anyut, and it's from the moment that you hear of the death up until the funeral. And the tradition understands that that's a period of profound sort of dislocation and confusion, and and really the only thing is to kind of go from step to step to step, and to do what needs to be done to prepare for the funeral. And technically speaking, any religious responsibility that you might have, you're exempt from that, because everybody understands you're not asking anybody to do anything at that point. And that's the immediate, and then that ends at, and that's the point that you're making again, sort of the funeral arrangements, maybe gathering your thoughts to speak about them, or figuring out who might be speaking, and taking direction, guidance from your rabbi, and that people who are closest to you are around you. It's not seen as the time for the larger community to swoop in. That usually that's sort of reserved for the shiva and the funeral and the shiva.
So that period's just like a couple of days until the person is buried.
Yeah. The same day, next day. Yeah. So that's the most immediate. That's the most immediate time.
Right.
The next, and then are you talking from the perspective of the mourner? The next phase happens immediately when the funeral starts. If you will, the operative mitzvah transfers from the burial of the dead, which we want to do immediately, to the comforting and the supporting of the mourner. And that happens at the funeral. That happens just as the funeral ends, when that first layer of earth is on the coffin.
And is it just the family or all the attendees shovel dirt on the
Everyone
everyone.
starts the honor, if you will, you want to call it an honor. Maybe the mitzvah is a better word, starts with the most immediate family. And there's something really beautiful about that too. I don't know if you've seen it, if you've experienced that. Starting with that first thud of earth hitting the coffin. It's very conscious that it's done right there. Because again, as a tradition, we're not ones to shy away from it, to deny its reality. And there's nothing more final than hearing that thud. But it's also seen as the highest mitzvah that you can do for somebody, because we understand that it can never be repaid, right? The person's dead. They can't repay that mitzvah. But that we don't leave it to strangers to bury our loved ones. It's the last thing that we can do. It's the last expression of love that we can give to them, which is that. But there's this shovel thing, and maybe you've seen it, like the spade, right? The spade is concave. Yeah, concave, right? And normally, if we're efficient, right, we kind of put it into the earth and, turn it over. But the first shovelful of earth, we turn the spade upside down, which is really inefficient, right? But that's sort of the point. We do the first shovelful of earth at the bottom side of the spade to show that we know we have to do it, but we don't want to do it with such haste and efficiency. We do it because we know that we have to. And so that's our way of showing that we're doing it with a heavy heart. And then we turn the shovel over and put in a couple of more. And some people don't consider it finished until it's all gone, that the earth, there's no more mound there. I often tell the story of a dear friend of mine who had to bury her 21-year-old daughter, who was a junior at Harvard, who got hit by a car in Harvard Square. If you can't imagine a more heartbreaking situation, and it was this, and you can imagine how many people were there at the funeral, between her college friends and high school friends and parents' friends and everybody, so nobody could leave until that last piece of dirt was there. But usually it's that there's a layer of earth that symbolically shows that we've completed that task.
Gives me goosebumps. I remember my grandmother's. I know my cousin started it off, and we all started doing it, and they made sure she was covered completely.
Yeah,
and it just is.
In a really weird way, it feels like you're tucking them in.
I want to sidestep a little bit, because this was also one of our big questions. People with tattoos being buried.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, Jewish people with tattoos being buried.
Buried in a Jewish cemetery.
Right.
So a word, it's one of my favorite words in Yiddish. It's called a baba maisa. If you've ever heard the word a baba maisa, it pretty much gets translated as an old wives' tale. A bubby. Please God, one day I'm a grandmother, and I hope my grandchildren call me Bubby, right? And a maisa is a story, so it's a grandmother's story. It's an old wives' tale, so it's a baba maisa, which has its roots in truth, but it's like lots of things that gets conflated. So I mean, I'm just going to put it out there. Can you imagine ever telling a Holocaust survivor that's got a tattoo on her arm that she's not going to be, or he's not going to be able to be buried in a Jewish cemetery? Could you imagine anything more ridiculous than that? So it's case in point. No, of course you can be buried in a Jewish cemetery with a tattoo. That being said, look, Jews do what they do, right? And there are lots of Jews with tattoos. And there are different reasons for people making those choices. In general, and this is a bioethics thing, and we might not want to get into the whole thing. Tattoos in generally are not seen as, as a favorable thing, mostly because it potentially opens us up to infection, and the fact that we see the human body as this beautiful creation, that there's really nothing much that we can do to it that's going to make it better looking than, there's obviously reconstructive surgeries, barring that, but for the most part, how we're born is really just, it's beautiful. And so so there's that, but no, and then there's some people that come to me, they have tattoos and they say, I can't convert to Judaism, I'll never be accepted. And I'll just really quickly say that Judaism also draws the distinction between doing something before you knew that it wasn't a thing in Judaism and then doing it afterwards. So maybe you have tattoos and you're thinking, yeah, maybe I won't get that other one or not. Again, Jews do what they do. And, especially in liberal Judaism, Reform Judaism, there's a great deal of latitude that's given to that. But no, there's nothing that you're going to do that's going to prevent you from being buried in a Jewish cemetery from that.
Thank you for answering that as a tattooed person. I'm sort of like, not sure where to go because I want to ask you more about burial, but I want to get through the phases of mourning. So.
Am I talking too much?
No, but we're at close to 8:40 and I want it to have a few minutes for people to throw questions at you if they want. So let me look at let's stick with the Jewish burial for a minute because we don't go into Shiva till after that, right?
Correct.
So I just want you to just kind of give us a little bit of a sample of what a Jewish funeral is and what kind of prayers are said there. Are things sung? Do people, talk about the deceased?
Yeah. So yes, the prayers are sung. I always sing them. If we have time, I'm happy to show you the text of some of the most commonly used prayers in Jewish funerals. As I said, it starts with the kriya, the ripping of the ribbon that some people wear for that month. It moves to some readings. Some of them can be modern, some of them can be very traditional. And then of course there's the eulogizing. Look, the purpose of a funeral is to come, if you will, squarely in the face of the reality of the loss of that person and turning the love and the relationship into sacred memory. And so this is the time that we start talking about them, talking about what was important to them, who they were, what brought them alive, what were their values, what made them laugh, what made them cry, what made you love them, what made them totally exasperating, right? It's not the time to like sanctify them, right? It's to be real with them and their memory. So, in a loving and respectful way, of course, but it's to bring their memory and their personality into the room because we know that we're not going to have them in the room. So there's a lot of that. And that's why, people who knew them best are the most important people to speak at a funeral. There are two very important prayers that are said at the end. One is the El Malei Rachamim. We can look at it later. And the other one, of course, is the Mourner's Kaddish. The Mourner's Kaddish, maybe we'll talk about that at a little bit, because that's a very profound and often known and very important ritual to many people. And then the very last thing after the Mourner's Kaddish is that everybody who's there forms two lines. And the most direct mourners, if you're any of those 7 relationships, remember mother, father, brother, sister, son, daughter, spouse, those relations walk through the line of people as they offer this phrase that basically translates to may you be comforted by the omnipresent one among all mourners. And that walking through the line is the official signal that we are transitioning from the mitzvah of burying the dead to comforting the mourners, and that's how a Jewish funeral ends. If you've got family nearby, often you'll see people picking up stones, as you saw, right, and they will leave stones on the grave. It's a way of marking that we've been there.
Oh, thank you for answering that, because I was going to tell you that. And those headstones at the beginning are my grandparents.
Yeah.
In Long Island. So so after the funeral, you go right to Shiva.
Yep.
Which can you let people know what Shiva means?
7. 7 days. Which is true. It's 7 days, but it's a bit of a misnomer because people are like, oh, I got to be home for a whole week and doing this. So, so the day of the burial counts as 1 day, and then the last day, the 7th day, we actually stop first thing in the morning. So that automatically brings us down to 6, but the first day is the funeral. So that's kind of 5. And then remember, we don't technically sit Shiva on Shabbat. So that kind of brings us down to 4. So traditionally speaking, yes, it's 7 days, but everything counts and some things don't. So there's that. And right in the liberal world, in the world that we live, people usually convene the evening hours, and that they say, look, I'm accepting visitors from this time to this time for this number of days. But that expands from there. As I said, my girlfriend who lost her daughter, she sat from 7 o'clock in the morning until 10 o'clock at night. There was a minyan there twice a day. They brought the Torah there on Monday and Thursday. And I knew how she liked her Starbucks in the morning because I was there at 7 a.m. with her Starbucks. So there are different ways. There's a lot of variation in the liberal world as well as the traditional world as to how much people sit, but yeah, it comes from the word 7.
I want to touch on interfaith couples, of which I am one, and can you just talk about who the Shiva is actually for, and could I sit Shiva for my wife, and then even though she's not Jewish, sit Shiva for me if she felt like it?
Thank you. That's such a wonderful and such an important question for the world that we live in today. Thank you. Yes. So I always like to say that funeral rites are for the dead, and mourning rites are for the mourner. So if you were a Jew, you mourn as a Jew, even if the person that you're mourning for isn't Jewish. And the person that died, if they're not Jewish, they're going to want to be buried in a way that speaks to their traditions, and we honor that. But as the mourner, it's for you. It's your process. So if, for example, you're mourning your non-Jewish wife, that's totally not only kosher, but it's what you would do as a Jew. And now that being said, in my world, in our world, I have officiated at the funerals of non-Jewish people because they have spent so much time married, if you will, to their Jewish partners. They don't consider themselves Jewish, but they don't consider themselves something else, and they love the way of Jewish death and dying, that's how they want it anyway. So I will alter the liturgy so that it's got integrity somewhat, but it's basically the same. And for the same, and maybe Judy, you want to raise, she is in mourning for her husband who died just a little under a year ago, and she now joins us every Shabbat and has been saying Kaddish for him. Again, in a minyan of 10 Jews, of which she is not, maybe not yet. But there's no reason not to be able to say these prayers. She wouldn't count in the minyan, not being Jewish, but it doesn't mean that she can't join the community to which she is feeling connected on some level, and in honor of her husband who was Jewish, who probably, we don't know, I don't know, would really appreciate the fact that you are saying Kaddish for him.
So I want to try and segue into that in a very thoughtful way. During Shiva, we say Kaddish, right? Yes. Is that every night?
Right. So the Kaddish, we're used to saying, oh, we got to say Kaddish, and our association with Kaddish is that it's the prayer that you say when you're mourning somebody. In fact, the Kaddish is sort of like a very garden variety prayer. And it actually occurs in every single prayer service up to 3, 4, even 5 times. The last one in every service is reserved for the mourner. That's how it gets called the mourner's Kaddish. Very slight variations, but really it's the same thing for all intents and purposes. And you may know that, traditional Jews, they pray in the morning, they pray in the afternoon, they pray in the evening. The Muslims, they thought they were outdoing us. They have 5 prayer services. They base it on our 3, but that's a whole nother story. So we stick with 3. That's enough, you know, and sometimes we double up. We do the afternoon and the evening together. That's a whole nother story. But yeah, so traditionally, you know, if you were taking your Kaddish very seriously, you might choose to say it 3 times a day for a year. I have to say that in the Reform world, that's very unusual. Although I do know some people in the Reform world that, you know, will go to their Reform synagogue, you know, when their Reform synagogue is, but they want to do it more often, and they'll go to places that will have daily minions, where these are offered. So it's anywhere from 3 times a day to whatever feels comfortable for you within that year. The tradition is that you say this prayer for 11 months, and then you stop, and then you say it again on the year anniversary, and then every year after that.
And can you just, for people that don't know, what it sort of, now it's not Hebrew, right? It's Aramaic. Right. And can you just kind of, because it doesn't talk about death, because it is, like you said, a garden variety prayer, but can you just sort of like give a summation of what it's saying?
That, yes. And it's an interesting thing, because the prayers that we have that still get done in Aramaic are because it's really important to know what it is that you're saying. And you're going, wait, how does that add up, right? Because we, as a people, for a very, very brief period of time in history, spoke Hebrew. Most of the time, the lingua franca, the language that we spoke, was Aramaic. So if it was important to know what it is that you're saying, the prayer would be in Aramaic. And so I'm not going to get into what are the other ones are that are in Aramaic, but the Kaddish is in Aramaic, so that people know what it is that they're saying, which is really funny, because if you're going to learn one language these days, it's going to be Hebrew, not Aramaic. We never said we always made that much sense. Nonetheless, so it, you know, should I bring it up? Should I bring up the text?
I want to see it. We got about 10 minutes.
All right, maybe not.
To 9. So
it is a prayer of praise of life, and of wonder, and of awe, and of connection to life. Doesn't mention death at all. It mentions God, but not death. And so there are some amazing books, and if you're interested in this, we have a little bibliography at the end. We were ready for this. And I'm going to say that its purpose, spiritually and liturgically, is twofold. When I use the word mythologically, it's not the word that it's a myth, so it's not true. It's like when I say in terms of sacred myth, that it's got meaning greater than its appearance. Mythologically speaking, when we say Kaddish, we understand that we are easing the soul of our loved one to its final rest and to its final connection with the grand holding tank of life. We understand that there is a period of time between death and a year that is tumultuous sometimes for the soul as it reaches its final rest. And that our saying Kaddish eases that transition, makes it quicker, and makes it less arduous, that journey of the soul in the afterlife. So that is one part of the great myth. And I use that term only with the utmost of reverence and respect. The other part of that is carving out a time for us to process not only the loss, but the meaning of that relationship. We all know mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters, spouses, they're the most complex relationships of our lives. and we love them often dearly, and those relationships are not always easy. Sometimes they're downright awful. And the tradition says that this too is part of the process of coming to terms not only with the loss, but maybe the loss of the dream of a relationship that never happened, or wasn't what you wanted it to be, or ended in a bad way, or who that person was to your own psychic development. So there is an element of saying Kaddish that carves this time out where you're saying this prayer, and have that time taken out of each day, each week, whenever it is, that gives you a time to spend a little time with your process in that. And if you will, the liturgy, the words of it itself connect us to sort of the grandparent, capital G, right? The one that is always with us, even when people that we expect to be with us abandon us or leave us or go die on us.
Thank you. Thank you for that. We're running out of time. I want to talk just quickly about afterlife and what we believe. It was a question that I know Sam threw my way in my focus group. And so do we believe in an afterlife? Is there heaven, hell? I had some names written down that I know pop up. Gan Eden, Gehinnom, is that right?
Gan Eden, Gehenna, yeah, or Gehenna.
So, I know there's talk about resurrection in regards to the Messiah, and also the world to come.
Yes.
Olam Haba. So have at it for a few minutes.
Oh yeah. There's also literature that mentions reincarnation. There's a Hebrew word for reincarnation, believe it or not. So okay, I need to start by saying that Judaism isn't a religion about belief. We're sort of told you can believe what you want. You really got to just do the right thing, right? And so lots of Jews believe lots of different things, and there are lots of Jews that say, when you're dead, you're dead. That's it. You're done. There's nothing left. And that's a perfectly fine Jewish belief. And then there are other people that say, as long as the person's values and stories and name is kept alive, then they are kept alive. And that's how they understand afterlife. And that's another perfectly acceptable way of sort of understanding and in a number. But there has been for a very, very, very long time a thread of literature that contemplates even more. And I want to spend a little bit of time with that. Because up until, I'd say 10, 20 years ago, rabbis didn't like to talk about it because that was the way that they were going to differentiate between, Judaism, which is focusing on this life, and often how Christianity is framed as it's more about the next life, right? So rabbis didn't want to talk about the next life because that's what the Christians talk about, so we're not going to talk about that. But that's just not true. We've had it. Okay. So, and what I'm going to say now is a version of Jewish belief. It is not the version, and it's not like dogma where it's like, this is the way it is. There are variations on the theme. So I'm going to give you some general themes that show up again and again. One, that we go by the premise that a soul is energy, life force. And if you will, we know by the laws of thermodynamics that energy can never be either created or destroyed. So the energy that is somebody's soul is something that, that is forever, can't be created or destroyed. So what happens to that soul? Now, Judaism has a version of heaven, but it's very different from, like how we're used to thinking about it in Christological terms. And it's often called Gan Eden. And the difference, if you will, between the Jewish understanding of, there are several, of the Jewish Gan Eden or heaven and maybe the Christian is one, first of all, everybody gets there. Soul energy is God's energy. God energy goes back to its source. It's sort of like I like to liken it to the water cycle, right? Clouds, rain, streams, waters, ocean, evaporation, back up to the clouds. Soul energy is the same way. Our bodies, by the way, the exact same way. Remember, we talked about that back to the earth, right? The bodies do that version. Our souls do the rest. And everybody gets to this Gan Eden. Gan Eden, if you will, that's sort of God's domain. Maimonides said, trying to describe what Gan Eden is to a human being is like trying to describe to a fish what it's like to breathe air. Think about that for a little while. I mean, we could spend an hour talking about breaking down that analogy, but it's a good one. They don't call him the Rambam for nothing. So there is this Gan Eden, this grand holding tank of life, if you will, which, by the way, many of the sources understand that that is the place from which new life is dispatched, which is where the idea, if you will, reincarnation, the word in Hebrew is Gilgul, which the root of the word Gilgul, which means reincarnation, is a wave, like a wave upon the shore, right? And if you think about it, right, a wave has its moment in time and then it gets brought back into the grand whole, right? So the word for reincarnation in Hebrew is based on a wave. It's a re-waving. Now everybody gets there, but not everybody gets there right away. Gan Eden is a place for pure soul energy. And so from when we are taught, and every Shabbat morning, every weekday morning, we pray, Elohai neshama shenatata bi tahorahi. It means, my God, the soul that you have implanted within me is pure. There is nothing that can be done to it to make it impure. It is a chip off the old divine block, and it is implanted firmly there. That's it. Okay. However, and as we can all imagine, it can get pretty banged up during the course of a life. Some people more, some people less, and some people do some pretty rotten things, as we know. And so while the nugget, right, the core of that soul is pure, it can be pretty battered and bruised. And I use the Jewish technical term, schmutzed up, right? It gets schmutzy, which is dirty, right? And so before it can return to that, if you will, grand holding tank of life, I call it, again, these are my very technical terms, I call it the dry cleaner. It's got to go through the dry cleaner, right? It's got to get sort of, it's got to get cleaned up. And this is where the word Gehenna comes from. Now, Gehenna is not hell. When we talk about hell in the Christological American, right, what do we talk about? We talk about a domain, which is like the domain of the anti-God, right? The devil, right? Eternal damnation, fire and brimstone. We go there forever. That does not exist in Judaism. It just doesn't. In Judaism, there is no place that is devoid of God, God's domain, God's presence, God's sovereignty. So there's no like devil that's in charge down there. Okay. It's talked about in various ways. And as you can imagine, being run through the ringer is not the same as being in the grand holding tank of life, communing with our creator back, with all of life, right? So it's a time of process. And sometimes it's described as not a necessarily pleasant process. Our sources say that the worst, that nobody spends more than a year in Gehenna. The worst of the worst of the worst, it takes a year to get from death to Gan Eden. They need that much time. And you can imagine that maybe the most innocent among us, maybe, babies, children, right? That, they just kind of do not pass go, do not collect $200, they, go right there. And the rest of us, we don't know how much time we're there. By the way, that is what Kaddish, mythologically speaking, theologically speaking, is meant to make easier and quicker that transition. And that's also, by the way, why we only say Kaddish for 11 months. We say Kaddish for 11 months because it would be the height of disrespect to even suggest that somebody that you loved or your parent was so evil as to deserve the full 12 months, we stop saying Kaddish at 11 months. That is why. So we have this practice, which might be rooted in logic, and, we have this, but it's really based on this idea of, this sort of recycling of soul energy and reuniting with the grand source of life. By the way, I also want to say that while you might say, wow, this is kind of phantasmagorical and a little obscure, not only does the very real practice of saying Kaddish for 11 months come from this idea, but so too the idea, sorry, that was my.
You have an alarm?
Never mind, it's later. That the most, that in the El Male Rachamim, the prayer that we say, the most profound and commonly used prayer that's actually said at every funeral and every Yizkor service, includes the phrase, may his or her soul be bound up in this eternal bond of life. So even in, our most, kind of everyday and prayers, and by the way, that's also one of the most commonly used expressions on a Jewish gravestone, refers to this, if you will, grand holding tank of life, this eternal bond of life. So that's kind of a little bit of afterlife in a nutshell.
Thank you. How are you doing? You've been, it's a lot of talking. All right, so I'm gonna open it up for questions. Joanne wants to know, and I did want to ask you this, can a non-Jewish person be buried next to her or his Jewish partner in the Jewish cemetery?
Right. So the answer to that is it's going to depend on the cemetery. There are some that are really restrictive, and that they do their own little investigation. And if you're not Jewish in the way that they say that you're Jewish, you're not getting buried there. And then there are some Jewish cemeteries that very specifically understand, because there is a principle that says there's a Jewish cemetery and only Jews are supposed to be in the Jewish cemetery, but Jews are creative. And we're also very real world. And we also know that people want to be buried with their loved ones, and not all our loved ones are Jewish. So what do we do? So some Jewish cemeteries, they sort of create separate, if you will, sections. And sometimes the sections are like really other sections, but that doesn't really do the trick. But sometimes the sections are nothing more than like a row of flowers, between, or something very innocuous between a Jewish grave and a non-Jewish grave that, are often like right next to each other. So that's really going to depend on the cemetery.
Okay, thanks. I want to backtrack because I don't know if Kat, if you could maybe unmute yourself and explain to us about the decompose service.
Oh, yes. Hello.
Hello.
Just really quickly, it's a new service, and basically you can have your body put into a pod, and they compost you. So was that something that would be acceptable?
Tell me more about the pod and what goes in there, and what it's made out of.
Dirt. Dirt goes into it. They don't put a casket.
Yeah. Okay.
The body is laid into the dirt, and they just compost you, and then eventually that compost is returned to the soil.
Beautiful. Absolutely. That's like the most Jewish of Jewish. In fact, the whole idea of a coffin, it's a little bit of it's like, okay, in some places it's a law that you have to have a coffin. But in Israel, honestly, most people are buried without a coffin. They're just sort of wrapped in this sort of biodegradable tachrichim, right? And put right into the earth. My teacher, my beloved teacher, Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, when he was making his plans for his own burial, was able to find a cemetery that would permit him to go right directly into the earth exactly for that reason. So it's more Jewish than it's a very, very Jewish practice. Whether or not you can is not a Jewish question. It's a question for the state and local laws and whether they require it, and the same thing with a cemetery. Like, for example, I've been told that in Louisiana, you know, it's so shallow and murky and muddy that, you know, you actually have to put metal in between graves, otherwise people come floating down the street. Don't quote me on that, but that's not, you know, and if you're a Jew, you still have to follow the laws. So you have to follow the rules, but something like that is beautiful and very Jewish, and not only within the spirit of what it is that the tradition teaches, but within the law as well.
That you brought up one point that we didn't get to, but and in New Orleans, a lot of people have to be buried in mausoleums and vaults or crypts. They have, because it is so like below the water table. So that's not being put back in the earth, right?
No, not technically. And actually, you know, I've done funerals like in Paramus, the Jewish cemetery. They have these niches, you know, and they're all above ground. You know, no, that's not exactly earthen. But what people will put the earth into the coffin in order to at least symbolically to do that and to allow that to happen.
All right. Does anyone else have any questions? You want to type it in the thing or unmute yourself and ask a question really quick? Going once, going twice. All right. This has been very, Judy?
Yes, I just have a question. Memorial service due to COVID.
Right. So, you know, this last year has been a bit of a revolution. And so I've done a number of what I call virtual memory circles, which is a sort of a combination, depends on how soon after the death, a memorial service, a shiva, a funeral, which is a way of gathering people over Zoom. COVID has made this whole process really complicated from an emotional and spiritual and communal part, and probably the most excruciating part of this whole COVID experience. So traditionally, you would go to the grave at around a year, and we do an unveiling of the stone, and so it's a way of gathering and marking. So now during COVID, it's my honor to convene a memory circle like this, and happy to plan it out with you or anybody else who wants to do it, put it on the calendar and talk about how we might structure it in a way that honors who Alan was and your love, and how you want to mourn and remember him. Because I can only imagine that for you, it feels like seriously, horribly unfinished business.
It is.
Yeah.
We'll talk.
Okay.
Thank you for asking that question, Judy. I was one that I wanted to bring up as we got crunched for time there. So Rabbi Moritt has put together a nice bibliography of suggested readings. And what I'm going to do is probably just email that as an attachment to all the attendees. You're going to bring it up on the screen now?
Trying to, and then, you know, best later.
It's fine. I'll send it as an attachment tomorrow when I email everyone and thank them.
Try it again. See if that works. But it's that. My email's there too. But you can
great.
While this is up. And, and if anybody has anything, whether it's visiting a cemetery or questions about Kaddish or studying the texts, or wanting to know about the cemetery plots that we have available, or just to talk, there's my email. It's right there. You can also find it on our website.